Hello everyone, and welcome back. Open the Maps app on your phone and zoom into any coastline in the world. Every bay is labeled. Every harbor is charted. Every cape and inlet sits exactly where the satellite confirmed it. Spin the globe with a finger, and the whole planet is mapped down to the last sand spit. This feels completely ordinary to us, but for most of human history, maps ended. Not at the edge of the earth, at the edge of knowledge. And what waited in the blank space beyond the last drawn line was not emptiness. It was everything that had not yet been written down. There was once a civilization whose own map of the world, every route they had sailed, every port they had found, every ocean current they had learned to read, has almost entirely vanished. Not because they failed to make one, but because the city where it was kept was burned to the ground so completely that nothing of its archive survived. What those people knew, how far they sailed, and what they may have found at the far edges of their geography remains one of the quietest mysteries in the history of exploration. Those people were the Phoenicians. And the question at the center of this video is simple, though its answer is not. Could they have reached the Americas? Centuries before Columbus ever stepped onto a Canary Islands dock and calculated where the trade wind was heading. To understand why that question deserves serious attention, we need to start not with a theory and not with a list of artifacts, but with a place. Picture a flat stretch of dusty ground on the northern coast of Tunisia. No columns, no dramatic ruins, just pale, dry earth under an afternoon sun. Walk across it, and nothing alerts you that you are standing somewhere important. But look at the way the late light falls, and you will see a faint circular depression in the soil, roughly 200 meters across, pressed into the ground like the faded memory of a ring. That circle was once the military harbor of Carthage. At its height, that harbor sheltered 220 warships, each in its own covered berth, arranged around the inner rim of the basin like spokes around a hub. The commercial harbor beside it was larger still. Every morning for several centuries, both basins were alive. Ships loading grain and silver and purple cloth and salted fish, crews readying for voyages that would carry those goods across a trading network stretching from what is now Lebanon to what is now southern England. This was the logistical center of the most commercially powerful civilization the ancient Western world had yet produced. Now picture what happened in 146 before the Common Era, when Rome won its final war against Carthage. Buildings pulled down stone by stone. The harbor filled with rubble. The population sold into slavery. The decision to erase the city entirely, rather than simply occupy or tax it, was deliberate and debated. Carthage had been Rome's most dangerous rival for over a century, twice coming close to defeating Rome in its own territory. The Roman Senate concluded that a city so capable of recovering and threatening again could not be left standing in any form. Total destruction was not cruelty for its own sake. It was a strategic calculation about what Carthage might become if allowed to exist. The Roman general Scipio Aemilianus stood at the edge of the burning ruins and reportedly wept. Not from grief for Carthage, but from a sudden awareness that what he was watching would someday be repeated. That Rome itself would eventually look like this. What matters most for our question is what went with the city. The Archive of Carthage. 5 centuries of navigational charts, trade logs, merchant correspondence, records of every commercial route the Phoenician world had ever worked, burned with the buildings. We do not have those charts. We never will. What we have in their place are the accounts of the people who competed with the Phoenicians, fought them, and ultimately destroyed them. The Greeks and Romans, who wrote about Phoenician sailors mostly when those sailors were in the way. The people who built Carthage were descendants of colonists from Tyre, a city on the coast of what is now Lebanon. The name Phoenician was not their own. It was a Greek label, derived from the Greek word for purple, the color of the dye these traders extracted from murex sea snails and sold at prices that made it the exclusive mark of royalty for centuries. The Phoenicians identified not with any nation, but with their individual cities: Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Berytus. What connected those separate cities, across generations and across political differences, was a single shared fact. The mountains of Lebanon rose steeply just a few miles inland from the coast, leaving almost no flat land between the rock and the sea. There was no room to build an agricultural civilization on that strip, so the Phoenicians built a maritime one instead. Picture that geography on a map: a thin coastal strip, nowhere more than a few miles wide, running between the Mediterranean and a wall of mountains. The cities sat right on the water's edge: Tyre on its island, Sidon with its two small harbors, Byblos on its rocky promontory. Behind each of them, the ground rose steeply into cedars and snow. There was no hinterland to farm, no river valley to settle, no inland plain to expand into. Everything the Phoenician world produced, it produced by sea. Everything it needed, it imported by sea. The ocean was not a direction these people chose to face. It was the only direction available to them. From the Bronze Age onward, Phoenician children grew up in harbor towns where ships were always being loaded and unloaded, where the smell of pitch and cedar was as ordinary as bread, and where knowledge of the sea passed from parent to child the way farmers pass knowledge of soil and season. By the time any written history begins to document the Phoenicians clearly, they are already established, already trading, already building the colonial network that reaches from Tyre to Cadiz. The beginning of that push is older than the written record. The maritime knowledge they carried into the historical period was already ancient by the time anyone thought to write it down. What it meant to know the sea. Picture a Phoenician harbor in the hours before dawn, a few hours before a long voyage departs. Fires have been burning since midnight beside cauldrons of pitch. Men work in the orange glow, pressing hot pitch with wooden paddles into the seams of a ship's hull, sealing every joint against weeks of open water. The hull itself was built from cedar, cut in the mountains of Lebanon. Dense, aromatic wood that resisted the rot that salt water accelerated in softer timbers. Egypt had been importing that same cedar for thousands of years. The trade between Lebanese forests and Egyptian shipyards is one of the oldest documented commercial relationships in the ancient world, reaching back to the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. From the very beginning, Phoenician cities existed to supply the sea and to sail it. The ships that left those harbors were not delicate. A Phoenician merchant vessel of the 1st millennium before the Common Era ran between 15 and 30 meters in length, wide-hulled, deep, built to carry weight rather than chase speed. A square sail on a central mast provided the main drive when the wind cooperated. Oars covered the gaps when the wind died, or when a harbor required careful maneuvering. The crew was small, a dozen to 20 men on a mid-sized vessel, and every one of them was a professional whose working knowledge of the sea had been handed down through generations of practice in waters that punished carelessness without mercy. But what truly set Phoenician sailors apart from most of their contemporaries was one specific skill: They navigated at night by the North Star. The Greeks understood this clearly enough that they named the star Phoenike, the Phoenician star, in acknowledgement of who had made it most practically useful. Hold that image for a moment. A Phoenician captain, alone on the stern deck in deep darkness, no coastline visible in any direction, finding his position from a single fixed point of light overhead. This was not mystical. It was geometry. The North Star sits almost directly above the Earth's rotational axis, so it barely moves across the night sky, providing a fixed reference for both latitude and direction. A sailor who could read it could move in any direction across open water and know exactly where north was. The horizon in every direction became navigable. Beyond the stars, Phoenician sailors read the ocean itself like a book. The color of the water, shifting from dark blue to green, told them about depth and proximity to shore. The behavior of specific seabirds at different distances from land told them how far offshore they were. Long, low swells rolling in from the southwest told them about storms far out to sea. Surface currents running warm or cold against the hull told them which water system they were moving through. None of this was guesswork. It was accumulated observational knowledge, refined across generations and transmitted through practical apprenticeship. The kind of knowledge that does not need to be written down, because it lives in the hands and the eyes of the person who uses it every working day. Modern researchers who have built and sailed replica ancient vessels have consistently found that these ships were more capable on open water than older scholarship assumed. The constraint on ancient navigation was not the physical design of the hull. It was knowledge. Knowledge of which winds blew when and where, and what currents ran beneath them. The Phoenicians had that knowledge in greater depth than almost any other people of their era. Imagine the harbor at Tyre during the city's peak. Two basins divided by the island's natural geography. The northern harbor served the routes east toward Egypt and the Levantine ports. The southern harbor served the routes west toward Cyprus, toward Sicily, toward the open Atlantic beyond. On any busy day, the docks smelled of cedar resin, pitch, fish sauce, and the metallic heat of worked bronze. The purple dye workshops that funded much of the city's wealth were positioned downwind from the residential quarters. The process of extracting color from thousands of murex snails produced a smell powerful enough that civic tolerance had its limits. Those workshops turned an ugly industrial process into one of the most expensive luxury goods in the ancient world. One more dimension of how Phoenician trade actually worked deserves attention, because it matters for what comes later. Phoenician commerce was not state-directed. There was no emperor ordering ships west. Trade was operated by merchant families, commercial houses, and private partnerships, each making decisions based on the economics of specific routes and specific goods, rather than any imperial agenda. This meant the system was fast. If a Carthaginian captain heard from a West African contact that a powerful wind blew west from a group of islands off the Moroccan coast, and blew for weeks without a break, the decision to investigate was his to make. No committee required. The profit motive was the authorization. Commercial exploration of this kind leaves almost no documentary record even when it happens, because no one involved has any reason to publicize what they have found. The ancient Mediterranean sailing season ran from roughly late March to early November. Outside those months, most captains refused to sail. Storms were too frequent, and navigating by stars became unreliable when clouds covered the sky for weeks at a stretch. Within the season, every route was planned around known wind systems. When the Etesian winds swept down across the Aegean, when the Levant wind set up along the Syrian coast, when the seasonal westerlies opened the passage from Sicily to Carthage. A captain who had internalized all of this was operating not from maps, but from a complete mental model of the ocean system he worked in. The Phoenicians had that model for the Mediterranean in full, and for a significant portion of the Atlantic beyond it. What they knew about the Atlantic trade winds, and whether that knowledge ever extended to the question of what those winds eventually led toward, is the gap at the center of everything that follows. Before we turn to that gap, it helps to understand one more thing about how ancient navigation worked, because it changes how we think about what a Phoenician captain would have noticed when sailing near the Canary Islands. Unlike modern navigation, where a chart tells you what you will find before you find it, ancient navigation was built on direct observation. You learned a route by sailing it, noting what the water looked like at each stage, what the winds felt like, where the currents changed temperature, what birds appeared at different distances from land. This knowledge was then transmitted through apprenticeship, not through texts, but through the body. A young sailor learned by watching an experienced captain read the sea, asking questions, developing judgment across years of practice. Over generations, this produced navigators of extraordinary sensitivity to the ocean environment. What it means for our question is this: a Phoenician or Carthaginian captain who regularly operated around the Canary Islands, who felt the trade winds blow day after day in the same direction, carrying the smell of nothing. No land, no fresh water, just open ocean, would have registered that as significant information. The question of what lay at the end of those winds would have been a professional question, not a philosophical one. The edge of the known world. Stand at the Strait of Gibraltar and look west. The rock walls narrow here to about 14 kilometers, and through the gap the Atlantic and the Mediterranean exchange water through a strong, permanent current, a visible seam between two different oceans. To Greek and Roman geographers, this was the end of the navigable world. They called the rock formations flanking the entrance the Pillars of Hercules, and in their imagination, what lay beyond them was something close to the edge of reality. An ocean too dark, too vast, and too unpredictable to enter with any confidence of returning. While those geographers were writing that, Phoenician ships were already on the other side. The city of Gadir, today's Cadiz, on the southwestern coast of Spain, was founded by Tyrian colonists around 1100 before the Common Era. Mark that on a timeline. Gadir was a functioning Phoenician Atlantic base before Homer composed the Iliad, before Greek colonization of the Western Mediterranean had properly begun. From Gadir, Phoenician and later Carthaginian commercial routes ran in both directions along the Atlantic coast. Follow the routes northward on a map, and they eventually reach Cornwall in southwestern England, where the tin mines produced the metal that the entire Mediterranean bronze industry depended on. Tin was scarce everywhere in the Mediterranean world. Whoever controlled the Atlantic tin supply controlled a strategic material. The Phoenicians held that control for centuries and guarded it with a ferocity their competitors found almost theatrical. Ancient sources describe Phoenician captains deliberately running their vessels onto shoals rather than allow a trailing Greek ship to follow them to the source. This is not the behavior of people who regarded the Atlantic as an obstacle. It is the behavior of people who regarded it as an asset they had no intention of sharing. Look at a map of the Bay of Biscay, the open water between the northern coast of Spain and the western coast of France. It is not a gentle body of water. Atlantic weather systems roll across it without warning, producing swells several meters high, even without local storms. Phoenician ships crossed it regularly, year after year, on the route to Cornwall. That single fact carries significant weight. These were not cautious coastal sailors hugging the shoreline whenever possible. They were open ocean sailors who handled genuinely rough Atlantic conditions as a matter of commercial routine. Their seamanship extended well beyond the relatively forgiving Mediterranean, long before we even begin to ask about transatlantic crossings. Follow the route southward from Gadir, and they push down the Atlantic face of Africa into increasingly tropical waters. A Carthaginian text, known as the Periplus of Hanno, dated by most historians to the late 5th or early 4th century before the Common Era, describes a fleet of 60 ships sailing south along the African coast until they reached a world completely different from anything the Mediterranean knew. Equatorial forests, rivers running warm, a volcanic peak visible from the sea, large fires moving through the darkness on shore at night. Most historians place the endpoint of that voyage somewhere around the Gulf of Guinea, modern Cameroon or Gabon. If that identification is right, a Carthaginian fleet had traveled more than 4,000 miles of Atlantic coastline, roughly 2,000 years before Columbus. The southward routes deserve one more moment of attention, because they establish something about Carthaginian maritime culture that is easy to underestimate. Hanno's expedition was not a small affair. 60 ships, multiple thousands of people. Colonists being settled along the route as the fleet advanced. This was a state-level enterprise, organized and funded by the government of Carthage, not a speculative commercial voyage by a single merchant house. The scale tells us that Carthage, by the late 5th century before the Common Era, was willing to commit major institutional resources to extending its Atlantic reach. The Periplus describes the fleet passing multiple headlands, founding colonies, encountering peoples who had no prior contact with Mediterranean civilization, and eventually reaching a coast of volcanic fire and equatorial heat that no Carthaginian had seen before. What it also tells us, and this is the part that matters most for our question, is that the southward direction was not the only direction the Atlantic could have been pushed. The same institutional capacity that sent 60 ships south along the African coast could, in principle, have sent a smaller fleet west from the Canary Islands. The question is whether anyone ever did. There is one more account worth pausing on. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, recorded a story of Phoenician sailors who circumnavigated the entire continent of Africa on commission from the Egyptian pharaoh Necho II, around 600 BCE. The voyage took 3 years. They departed from the Red Sea, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, and returned through the Strait of Gibraltar. Herodotus notes that he personally does not believe one detail of the report. The sailors claimed that at the southernmost point of the voyage, the sun was on their right side. That makes no sense in Mediterranean experience. The midday sun always crosses the southern sky, so it should appear on the left when a ship heads west. But south of the equator, the midday sun is to the north. The detail Herodotus found most unbelievable is, by modern astronomical understanding, exactly correct for a ship rounding the Cape of Good Hope. Now look at a wind map of the Atlantic at the latitude of the Canary Islands, a volcanic archipelago roughly 100 kilometers off the Moroccan coast, known to the ancient world under various names. From the Canaries, the northeast trade winds blow steadily, reliably, and powerfully toward the west. Not occasionally, every day, for every month of the year. Columbus stopped at the Canaries in 1492, specifically to pick up those winds. From there to the outer islands of the Caribbean is roughly 5,000 kilometers, a crossing of 5 to 8 weeks under steady trade wind conditions. Any Phoenician or Carthaginian sailor operating regularly in those waters would have felt those winds on his face every single day. The Phoenicians were driven not by curiosity, but by profit. Every extension of their commercial range followed the same calculation, that something valuable existed at the end of a feasible route. The question of what those westward winds led toward is exactly the kind of question a culture built on following viable routes to new goods would eventually ask. Whether anyone followed them far enough to find an answer is what separates the question we can answer from the one we cannot. The merchant's logic. Before looking at the specific evidence that has accumulated around the Phoenician Americas question, it helps to visualize what was waiting on the other side of the Atlantic during the period we are talking about. Because the western shore of that ocean was not empty. On the Gulf Coast of what is now Mexico, in the hot lowland region of Veracruz and Tabasco, the Olmec civilization was at its cultural peak between roughly 1500 and 400 before the Common Era, an overlap of several centuries with the height of Carthaginian Atlantic activity. The Olmec built large ceremonial centers at San Lorenzo, La Venta, and Tres Zapotes. They quarried basalt boulders weighing up to 40 tons from mountains dozens of miles away and transported them, using methods not entirely understood, to their ceremonial sites, where they carved them into enormous portrait heads, some nearly 3 meters tall. They developed an early form of writing and a calendrical system. They ran long-distance trade networks across Mesoamerica, and they possessed materials that any Mediterranean merchant would have immediately recognized as luxury goods: cacao, rubber, fine jade, high-quality cotton. A Phoenician captain who somehow arrived on that coast and returned to Carthage with samples of those goods would have walked into the city carrying commodities that had no existing price, because no one in the Mediterranean world had ever seen them. The chronological overlap between Olmec fluorescence and Carthaginian Atlantic activity proves nothing by itself. Many civilizations were developing in parallel during this period without any documented interaction. What the overlap establishes is that the destination, if any ship had followed the trade winds to their end, would not have been an uninhabited shore. It would have been a world with organized cities, skilled craftsmen, and novel goods. The precise combination the Phoenician commercial system was designed to find and exploit. The relationship between Phoenicia and Egypt adds a structural layer worth noting. Egypt was Phoenicia's oldest continuous trading partner, buying their cedar since the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, and through that relationship, the Phoenicians had access to the commercial products of Egypt's own extended networks. Goods from sub-Saharan Africa moving north through Nubia, luxury materials from the Indian Ocean moving west through the Red Sea. If any goods from the Americas were somehow entering the ancient Egyptian economy, the most plausible commercial pathway would run through the most active long-distance maritime traders in the Mediterranean. This is not evidence of transatlantic contact. It is an observation about where the Phoenicians sat in the structure of ancient commerce, and about why, if any such contact occurred, their network would have been the logical conduit for whatever moved through it. There is also the matter of commercial secrecy. The Phoenicians protected their trade routes systematically because commercial knowledge was competitive advantage in the most direct sense. The captains who ran their ships onto shoals rather than let Greek competitors follow them to Cornwall were expressing standard commercial practice, not exceptional heroism. A transatlantic route, if one had been found, would not have been announced in any inscription or shared with any Greek or Roman observer. It would have been the most closely guarded commercial secret in Carthage, held within the organization that found it, transmitted on a strict need-to-know basis, never written anywhere accessible to outsiders. When Carthage fell, it would have burned with everything else. Now look at the Olmec colossal heads. 17 basalt portraits, produced at multiple sites over several centuries, each depicting the face of a powerful individual, almost certainly a ruler, with a remarkable consistency of style across generations. Since their discovery in the 19th century, observers have noted that the facial features of several of the heads, particularly the proportions of the nose and mouth, bear a resemblance to features more commonly associated with West African populations than with the indigenous peoples of Mesoamerica. The mainstream position of Mesoamerican archaeology holds that this resemblance reflects the natural range of physical variation within indigenous populations, rather than any external influence. That position is reasonable and should not be dismissed. But it has a notable limitation. It explains what the faces are not, without fully accounting for why this specific combination of features appears with such consistency across the most important sculptural tradition the Olmec produced. The most powerful people in the most powerful civilization in Mesoamerica were repeatedly depicted in a style that strikes outside observers as unusual. The question that raises has not been answered by pointing to indigenous diversity. There is one more piece of context about the Olmec that is relevant here. The Olmec site of San Lorenzo reached its peak around 1200 to 900 before the Common Era, placing it squarely within the period when Gadir was already an established Phoenician Atlantic base and Carthaginian commercial routes were actively developing along the African coast. La Venta, which succeeded San Lorenzo as the dominant Olmec center, flourished between roughly 900 and 400 before the Common Era, again directly overlapping with the centuries of maximum Carthaginian Atlantic reach. The colossal stone heads at these sites required the transport of basalt boulders weighing up to 40 tons across rivers and coastal lagoons from quarries in the Tuxtla Mountains, roughly 50 to 100 kilometers away. This feat of logistics tells us something important. The Olmec were not a simple farming community. They were an organized, hierarchical society capable of mobilizing large labor forces for projects requiring sustained planning and coordination. They were, in other words, exactly the kind of society that a Phoenician merchant would have recognized as a trading partner. Organized enough to have something worth exchanging, and organized enough to enforce an exchange. It is worth stepping back and looking at the broader map of the ancient world during this period. Between roughly 1000 and 400 before the Common Era, the Old World was more connected than is often recognized. Greek colonies were spreading across the Mediterranean. Indian Ocean trade was linking the Persian Gulf to the coasts of India and East Africa. The early Silk Road was beginning to carry goods between Central Asia and China. The Phoenicians sat at the center of the western portion of this network as its most active maritime operators. In a world where long-distance commercial contact across thousands of miles was a routine feature of economic life, the specific question of whether any part of that network extended across the Atlantic is less extraordinary than it might initially sound. What does not fit the standard account? In the early 1970s, an underwater archaeologist named Willard Bascom was running a sonar survey of the seafloor in waters off the coast of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. He was not looking for ancient contact evidence. His interest was the general question of what lay on the bottom of those waters. His sonar images returned shapes on the seafloor that he believed matched the outline of ceramic amphoras, the large, two-handled storage jars that were the standard bulk cargo container of the ancient Mediterranean world. Picture those shapes sitting in the sediment, visible only as shadows on a sonar screen. Objects that, if they were what Bascom thought, should not exist on that seafloor at all. He filed a cautious report. He noted that physical examination would be necessary. He He communicated the coordinates to Brazilian authorities. The examination never happened. The coordinates became difficult to verify in later accounts. The objects were never brought to the surface. The finding was not refuted. It was simply not followed. This pattern, a potentially significant discovery that quietly disappears from the investigative record, appears at several points in the literature on ancient transatlantic contact. It does not require a conspiracy to explain. Investigating a heterodox claim that turns out to be wrong carries a professional cost that not investigating it does not. The system is conservative by design. But that conservatism has a consistent effect. Certain questions accumulate suggestive evidence for decades without ever receiving the systematic investigation that might resolve them one way or another. The most debated piece of textual evidence in this area is the Paraíba inscription. In 1872, a handwritten letter arrived at the Instituto Histórico y Geográfico Brasileiro from an anonymous correspondent, reporting that workers on a plantation in the northeastern state of Paraíba had uncovered a stone tablet bearing unknown writing. A transcription of the text was enclosed. The original stone was never produced for examination. When examined by scholars of ancient Semitic languages, the transcription appeared to be a form of Phoenician. The content described a fleet of 10 Carthaginian ships separated from a larger convoy during a voyage around Africa, which had eventually found themselves on an unknown coast to the west of the ocean, dating the voyage to approximately 531 before the Common Era. Initial scholarly response was largely dismissive. The question might have ended there, except that in the 1960s, the American Semitic scholar Cyrus Gordon looked at the transcription carefully and argued that several linguistic features, specific prepositions, unusual verb forms, dialectal characteristics of Punic not well understood by 19th century scholars, were too technically precise to have been fabricated in 1872. His position was not that the inscription proved a transatlantic voyage. It was that the text could not be cleanly dismissed on philological grounds, and that the question deserved more careful attention than it had received. Without the original stone, the debate cannot be closed, but it cannot be cleanly won by either side either. A scattered body of physical evidence involves ancient Punic coins found at various locations along the eastern seaboard of North America, reported by independent finders across several decades. Picture a small bronze disc, a Carthaginian coin, stamped with an image no North American indigenous person would have produced, turning up in soil in New England or the Carolinas. A single coin proves nothing. Coins travel through many hands across many centuries. But when similar objects appear at multiple independent locations reported by unconnected people across a long span of time, the pattern at minimum warrants systematic examination. That examination has not taken place. Then there is evidence from an entirely different kind of source, the preserved body of a person who has been dead for 3,000 years. In the 1990s, the German toxicologist Svetlana Balabanova analyzed tissue and hair samples from 9 Egyptian mummies in the Munich Museum collection, including a priestess named Henut Tawi, dated to approximately 1000 before the Common Era. The chemical analysis detected the metabolites of both nicotine and cocaine at significant concentrations. Nicotine comes from tobacco plants of the genus Nicotiana. Cocaine comes from the Andean coca plant. Both are, by the standard account of botanical history, native exclusively to the Americas, and neither was present in the Old World before the 16th century, according to the received historical account. Balabanova published the results in a peer-reviewed journal. The initial response was strongly skeptical. Contamination of the samples was proposed as the most probable explanation. Balabanova invited independent verification. Several other laboratories tested the same samples and confirmed the presence of the compounds. The contamination hypothesis remains the mainstream position, but the specific pathway by which contamination would produce those compounds at those concentrations, distributed across the preserved tissues of multiple individuals from different provenances, has never been convincingly demonstrated. The findings remain published in peer-reviewed literature, unretracted. A completely different category of evidence came from Thor Heyerdahl in 1969 and 1970. Heyerdahl built a vessel, Ra, then Ra II, in the style of ancient Egyptian reed boats, using traditional construction methods, and attempted to sail it from the coast of Morocco across the Atlantic. His first attempt failed due to a construction flaw. His second, Ra II, completed the crossing from Morocco to Barbados in 57 days, using the same Atlantic wind systems available to ancient mariners. Picture that reed boat arriving in Barbados, a vessel that looked like it belonged in a museum, built without a single metal fitting, having just crossed 5,000 kilometers of open Atlantic. The experiment did not prove that any ancient civilization crossed the Atlantic. It proved that the crossing was physically achievable in an ancient-style vessel with no modern navigational technology. A Phoenician merchant ship was more robustly built than a papyrus reed boat and crewed by professional deep-water sailors. The argument that the Atlantic was simply uncrossable in ancient conditions is not a viable one. There is also the question of what lies on the ocean floor. The Atlantic has an average depth of roughly 3,300 meters and has been surveyed in meaningful resolution for only a fraction of its total area. Ancient wooden ships that sank in those depths would have been destroyed by pressure and organic decay within centuries, leaving at most ceramic cargo and metal fittings sitting on the bottom. Finding them requires systematic sonar survey of the right areas, guided by the right questions with the right technology. That survey has not been done. The absence of confirmed ancient wrecks in the Atlantic tells us that we have not looked. It does not tell us that there is nothing there. What is striking when you lay these pieces of evidence side by side is not any single one of them individually. It is the pattern of how each has been treated. The Paraíba inscription, unresolved since 1872. The Bascom amphoras, unexamined since the 1970s. The mummy analysis, disputed since the 1990s. In each case, the finding appeared, generated attention, met institutional skepticism, and settled into a permanent state of inconclusive dispute, without ever receiving the kind of well-resourced, systematic investigation that genuine resolution would require. Important questions get answered when institutions decide to answer them. The Phoenician question has not yet reached that decision. The problem of the missing archive. There is an argument frequently applied to the Phoenician Americas question, and it sounds decisive. The argument is this: if the Phoenicians had reached the Americas, there would be a record of it. There is no record. Therefore, they did not reach the Americas. The logic is clean, but the premise that a record would exist if the event had occurred depends entirely on one thing: the survival of the Phoenician archive. And the Phoenician archive does not exist. Consider what that archive would have contained. The Phoenicians were the people who gave the alphabet to the Greek world, and through the Greeks, eventually to almost every alphabetic writing system in use today. The letters you are reading right now trace their shape through Latin and Greek back to the Phoenician script developed in the Levant more than 3,000 years ago. A civilization that invented the alphabet used it constantly. Their commercial empire ran on written documentation, contracts on clay and papyrus, navigational charts updated with each voyage, correspondence between merchant houses at opposite ends of the Mediterranean. 5 centuries of that material would fill an entire building. Almost none of it survived. Picture the siege of Tyre in 332 before the Common Era. Alexander the Great's forces had been stopped by the island city's walls for 7 months. Alexander's engineers built a causeway out to the island. You can still see the peninsula it created on any satellite map of the Lebanese coast today, a spit of land that was not there before Alexander. When the city finally fell, most of its population was killed or sold. The institutional memory of the commercial capital of the Phoenician world was broken in a way that did not recover. When Carthage fell in 146 before the Common Era, it did not merely lose a war. It lost its archive. Every navigational chart, every trade record, every route log that Carthaginian sailors had ever compiled, burned or buried under rubble that later generations had no reason to excavate. We will never read those documents. They are gone. What we know of the Phoenicians comes almost entirely from other people's words. The Hebrew Bible mentions them as craftsmen and trading partners. Greek historians describe their commercial activities when those activities intersected with Greek interests. Roman writers covered Carthage because it was Rome's greatest enemy, and their accounts are written from the perspective of people who eventually won. What is almost entirely absent is the Phoenician account of themselves, what they considered their greatest achievements, what routes they knew that no one else did, what they believed lay at the far edge of the ocean they had spent centuries learning to read. Picture what it would mean to know ancient Rome only through the writings of Carthage, to have every Roman account destroyed and only Carthaginian descriptions of Rome remaining. We would know that Rome was a military power that eventually defeated Carthage. We would know some of the goods Rome traded. We would know what Rome looked like to a commercial rival across a long period of conflict. But we would have no Caesar, no Cicero, no Virgil. No Roman account of what Rome valued or what Romans believed about themselves. No Roman navigator's log. No Roman merchant's letter. Just the outline of a powerful civilization, seen from the outside by people who eventually lost to it. This is precisely the situation we are in with the Phoenicians. We have their outline. We have what their competitors and conquerors chose to record about them. And from that filtered, partial, externally generated account, we are trying to determine whether they crossed an ocean. The argument from absence in this specific case is therefore much weaker than it sounds. We are not looking at a situation where a complete record was kept and no mention of a transatlantic voyage appears in it. We are looking at a situation where the record was systematically destroyed, and we are noting that the destroyed record does not contain the account we are asking about. A library that burned cannot tell you what was on its shelves. This is the distinction historians call the difference between absence of evidence and evidence of absence. Absence of evidence means we have not found proof of something. Evidence of absence means we have positive reason to believe it did not exist. The first is compatible with the thing having happened. The second rules it out. For the Phoenicians, we have absence of evidence, produced by deliberate destruction. We do not have evidence of absence. Those two things are not the same, and conflating them is how a factual-sounding argument quietly becomes a misleading one. Even if the archive had survived intact, a transatlantic route would likely not have appeared in it publicly. Commercial knowledge was a competitive asset the Phoenicians guarded with determination. A viable route across the Atlantic, if one had been discovered, would have been the most carefully protected secret in Carthage. It would have lived in private correspondence between merchant partners, in navigational notes held by the captains who worked the route, in charts kept in locked commercial archives rather than displayed in public temples. It would never have been visible to any Greek or Roman observer. And when Carthage fell, it would have disappeared along with the private archive that held it. Not because it was unimportant, but because commercially sensitive knowledge is precisely the kind that does not outlast the institution that protects it. The Greek and Roman sources that constitute almost everything we know about the Phoenicians share one characteristic worth noting. They describe the Phoenicians almost exclusively from the outside, and almost exclusively in contexts of commercial rivalry or military conflict. The Greeks wrote about Phoenician traders when those traders were competing with Greek interests. The Romans wrote about Carthage when Carthage was threatening Rome. What is almost entirely absent is any sense of what the Phoenicians thought about themselves, what they valued most in their own civilization, or what they believed they had accomplished. The interior of Phoenician culture is gone. We have the outside of their world, the inside burned with Carthage. It is worth being precise about what the destruction of the Carthaginian archive actually means for the questions we are trying to ask. We have, in broad outline, the shape of their commercial network, the colonies they established, the goods they traded, the general directions their routes followed. What we do not have is anything resembling an internal account of their navigational knowledge. We do not know what Carthaginian navigators understood about the behavior of the Atlantic at different latitudes. We do not know what geographical intelligence they had accumulated about the African coast beyond their documented voyages. We do not know what, if anything, they had learned about the ocean west of the Canary Islands. These are not gaps that careful scholarship can fill by inference. They are absences created by destruction. And the honest position about them is not that the evidence shows the Phoenicians lacked that knowledge. It is that the evidence is simply not there to tell us either way. The standard we apply. Picture a long, flat headland on the northern tip of Newfoundland. The wind off the Labrador Sea is steady and cold. The vegetation is low, pressed down by years of coastal weather. In the early 1960s, a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife, Anne Stine Ingstad, were traveling along this coast, following references in the Vinland sagas, medieval Icelandic narratives that described Norse voyages to a fertile land somewhere west of Greenland. At a place called Lance o' Meadows, a local fisherman pointed them toward a series of low, grass-covered mounds near the shore. Excavation over several seasons revealed the outlines of turf-walled buildings, a smithy with evidence of iron smelting, and a small collection of objects: iron boat rivets, a spindle whorl for spinning wool, a ring-headed bronze pin of the type found in Norse contexts in Iceland and Greenland. The structures dated to approximately the year 1000 of the Common Era. Today, the site is in mainstream history textbooks. The Norse presence in North America is established historical fact. The Vinland sagas are treated as substantially historical documents. Now ask, what kind of evidence did it take to establish this? One site, found largely by chance, led there by a local fisherman, in a location where the cold, dry conditions of a subarctic headland happened to preserve turf structures and metal objects across 1,000 years. Without those grass-covered mounds on that specific headland, the Vinland sagas would still be where they were before 1960, on a shelf marked interesting but unreliable, assessed with exactly the skepticism now applied to the Phoenician contact claim. The Phoenicians operated 6 to 8 centuries before the Norse. The coastlines they might have reached lie in tropical and subtropical environments, where organic material, wood, rope, fiber, decays within decades in heat and humidity. Sea levels along the Caribbean and South American coasts have shifted since the first millennium before the Common Era. Thousands of years of agriculture, flooding, and construction have reworked the upper archaeological layers across the regions most accessible to a trade wind arrival. The probability that a brief Phoenician contact, even if it occurred, would leave physical traces recoverable today is genuinely small. We are not applying the same evidentiary test to the Phoenician claim that we apply to the Norse one. We are applying fundamentally different tests to situations that, in terms of the material traces they would leave behind, are simply not comparable. The Polynesian case adds something equally important. Picture a map of the Pacific Ocean and mark one by one the island chains that Polynesian navigators settled. Hawaii, Easter Island, New Zealand, the Marquesas, Samoa, Tonga, the Society Islands. The distances between those points are staggering. Some crossings exceed 5,000 kilometers of open ocean, farther than the trade wind route from the Canaries to the Caribbean. Polynesian sailors made those crossings in outrigger canoes, with no compass, no written charts, and no instruments beyond their accumulated knowledge of stars, ocean swells, currents, and the behavior of birds. We accept this as established historical fact because genetics, linguistics, archaeology, and the survival of traditional navigation knowledge all converge into evidence too strong to deny. No single piece established the conclusion. The cumulative weight of many independent lines pointing in the same direction did. But here's the point worth holding. If you tried to reconstruct Polynesian transoceanic navigation from physical artifacts alone, without the genetic evidence, without the linguistic connections, without the oral tradition of navigation, you would see nothing. You would see isolated island settlements with no apparent connection between them. The vast, systematic network of intentional voyages that created those settlements would be completely invisible in the material record. This is not a hypothetical. It is the actual situation the Phoenician case presents, minus the additional lines of evidence that resolved the Polynesian case. Whether equivalent lines of evidence exist for Phoenician Atlantic activity and have simply not yet been assembled is a question neither archaeology nor history has yet seriously tried to answer. The Polynesian comparison carries one further implication that is worth making explicit. When European explorers first encountered Polynesian islands in the 18th century, they found populations who had no idea that each other existed. The Pacific was so vast, and the intervals between contacts so long, that generations of islanders had grown up with no knowledge of the wider network they were part of. A Polynesian sailor who reached Hawaii from the Marquesas might have been celebrated in his own community, but his voyage would not have produced a durable record visible to anyone beyond that community. The knowledge of what he had found would have been transmitted orally, encoded in navigation chants, carried in the memories of the navigators who followed him. If that oral tradition had been disrupted by disease, by conquest, by the kind of systematic destruction that Rome visited on Carthage, the voyage would have left no trace. The Polynesian case succeeded in recovery because the additional evidence from genetics and linguistics allowed historians to reconstruct what the material record alone concealed. The Phoenician case does not yet have that additional evidence. Whether it exists and has simply not yet been assembled, or whether it does not exist, is a genuinely open question. There is one more structural difference between the Phoenician and Norse cases that bears directly on the evidentiary question. At Lonso Meadows, the Norse left a settlement. However brief, they built structures. Structures leave foundations. Foundations can survive. A Phoenician commercial voyage would not have built anything. Picture instead a ship anchoring in a Caribbean bay, crew going ashore, trading or exploring for days or weeks, then departing with whatever they had found. That visit leaves almost nothing behind. Perhaps a piece of broken cargo on the seafloor. Perhaps a coin dropped in the shallows. Perhaps marks on the landscape too subtle to be recognized as culturally significant by later inhabitants who did not know what they were looking at. The absence of a confirmed site means something very different for a trading voyage than it means for a settlement. A settlement leaves a site. A voyage leaves almost nothing. The institutions that write history. Beyond the specific evidence, there is a structural dimension to this question worth spending time with. Not whether the Phoenicians crossed the Atlantic, but how we decide what counts as settled history, and why that process sometimes diverges from the process of determining what is actually true. Think of the institutions of historical scholarship as a physical building. The established framework of ancient history is the architecture, the walls, the load-bearing structures, the layout of the rooms. Evidence that confirms the existing framework can be added to the building without disturbing anything. Evidence that challenges the framework is more like being told the foundations need rethinking. The first kind of evidence is welcomed. The second kind faces friction. Not because the people inside are dishonest, but because institutions are designed to protect against false positives. And a challenge to the framework is a much larger claim than an addition to it. The Norse case shows how a framework shift actually happens. When the physical evidence at Lonso Meadows was excavated and proved unambiguous, the institutional framework moved quickly. The transition was fast, not because the textual evidence was new. The Vinland sagas had existed for centuries, but because the physical site was too concrete to explain away. What the Phoenician question is waiting for is that same kind of anchor. A physical discovery, unambiguous enough that the framework has no choice but to shift. It has not come. The Bascom amphoras were not examined. The Paraiba stone was never found. The coin evidence has not received systematic investigation. The mummy analysis remains disputed. The question sits in a holding pattern, interesting but unconfirmed, unlikely to generate funded research priority, waiting for a discovery that may or may not arrive. Part of the reason is that confirming Phoenician transatlantic contact would require a larger revision than confirming Norse contact did. Norse contact simply extended the timeline of European arrival in the Americas by 5 centuries. Everything else about the standard narrative stayed intact. Phoenician contact would imply something more disruptive. That parts of the Old World commercial network knew about the Americas for centuries before Columbus. That the Columbian exchange was not a first contact, but a reconnection. And that the standard story of discovery, with its implied sense of the Americas as a world sealed off from the Old World until 1492, rests on a foundation substantially thinner than it is usually presented as being. Larger revisions encounter larger resistance. Not because the evidence against them is necessarily stronger, but because the consequence of accepting them is more significant. There is a concrete way to see how this resistance works. Imagine a scholar in 1960 who stood up at a conference and argued that Norse sailors had reached North America 500 years before Columbus. Picture the room, the raised eyebrows, the polite but firm pushback from colleagues who pointed to the absence of any confirmed archaeological site. That scholar would have been offering the same evidence for Norse contact that exists today for Phoenician contact. Narrative texts of uncertain reliability, scattered artifacts of ambiguous provenance, and the absence of any physical site to anchor the claim. The difference is that in 1961, the excavations at Lonso Meadows began. The physical site arrived. The framework shifted. The 1960 scholar was vindicated by a discovery that, in retrospect, had been waiting to be made for 1,000 years. The Phoenician question is sitting in exactly the position that the Norse question occupied in 1959. Evidence accumulating, framework resistant, waiting for the discovery that would force a reconsideration. Whether that discovery comes in 5 years, 50 years, or never, is something no one can currently know. Over the course of the 20th century, the picture of what the ancient world was capable of shifted consistently in one direction. The Polynesian navigators moved from primitive drifters to extraordinary intentional voyagers. The Amazon basin moved from empty jungle to a densely managed landscape of cities and cultivated land, visible now from the air as geometric patterns in the soil, earthworks, raised fields, the ghost outlines of ancient urban planning. Pre-Columbian Norse contact with North America moved from Icelandic legend to confirmed historical fact. In each case, someone decided that a heterodox claim was worth investigating seriously, and the investigation produced evidence that the framework could not absorb without changing. The Phoenician question is waiting for the same decision. The ancient world was more connected than our records of it suggest. That is not a mystical claim. It is the straightforward consequence of recognizing that our records are the residue of what survived, not a complete account of what happened, and that the Phoenicians happen to have left behind the least complete record of any commercially significant civilization in the ancient Mediterranean, because the most systematic destruction was visited on their archives. Assigning meaning to their silence is an interpretive choice. It is not the only reasonable one. What the wind does not say. There is a way of understanding what the Phoenician question reveals about historical knowledge that becomes clearer if you hold a specific image in mind. Think of the historical record not as a window showing you the past, but as a lamp held in a dark room. The lamp illuminates wherever it faces. Egypt, which produced durable records in durable materials across a long institutional continuity, is brilliantly lit. We can read the names of its pharaohs, the contents of its granaries, the prices in its markets. Greece and Rome, whose texts were copied and preserved across centuries of deliberate effort, stand clearly in the light. The Phoenicians, who produced records in abundance but whose entire archival infrastructure was destroyed twice, first at Tyre, then at Carthage, are in the dark. Not because nothing was there, because the lamp does not reach them. The brightness of the illuminated parts creates a misleading impression about the dark ones. What is not visible seems insignificant. The silence in the record seems to be a silence in the past. But the Phoenicians were, by any fair measure of commercial impact, among the most significant people in the ancient Mediterranean world. They shaped the region's economy for centuries. They gave the world its alphabet. They sailed across an ocean range no other ancient civilization matched. And we know almost nothing of this from their own voice, because that voice was destroyed. And what remains is only what their neighbors and enemies chose to say about them. Whether they reached the Americas may never have a definitive answer. The physical evidence that would confirm it, if it exists at all, lies in environments where preservation is poor, in ocean waters that have barely been surveyed, and in coastal regions where thousands of years of human activity have complicated the upper archaeological record. The evidence that would definitively disprove it does not exist either. The archive that would settle the question in either direction burned with Carthage. future investigation could still change the picture. Deep ocean survey technology has improved significantly and continues to develop. The Caribbean coast and northeastern South America have not been systematically examined with the specific question of pre-Columbian Old World contact as a primary research frame. The possibility of a discovery that shifts the argument is not zero. It is small, and it depends on someone deciding the question is worth pursuing with the resources that would be required. There is something that might be called the patience problem in historical research. A question requiring a physical discovery to resolve can only be resolved when someone decides to look in the right place with the right technology. That decision requires institutional priority and funding, which require the question to already be taken seriously. The site at Newfoundland waited 1,000 years for someone to look at the right grassy mounds. The Phoenician question may be waiting for its own equivalent. A survey of the right stretch of seafloor, an excavation in the right coastal sediment by someone already carrying the right question in mind. It is also possible that nothing will ever be found, that the question will remain permanently open, a genuine uncertainty about whether the greatest commercial sailors of the ancient Mediterranean world, operating from Atlantic ports, reading the trade winds better than almost anyone, ever followed those winds far enough west to see what was on the other side. Both possibilities deserve to be held at the same time, without forcing either one into a premature conclusion. That is what honest engagement with the limits of historical knowledge requires. Not a confident claim, not a comfortable dismissal. A sustained attention to the question and to the shape of what we do not know. What makes the Phoenician question worth sitting with, beyond any specific claim about transatlantic contact, is what it reveals about the relationship between evidence and conclusion in historical reasoning. We make claims about the ancient world every day with confidence. Claims about what was possible, what was known, what was connected to what, that rest on exactly the same kind of circumstantial inference that the Phoenician Americas hypothesis rests on. The difference is that the claims we accept have the advantage of institutional momentum behind them. They have been repeated in textbooks long enough to feel settled. The claims we resist have not yet accumulated that institutional weight. The Phoenicians had the capability. They had the motive. The ocean had the mechanism. The archive that would confirm or deny it was destroyed 2,000 years ago. In those conditions, the absence of a confirmed record is not a verdict. It is a silence. And silences, in history, are not always empty. Go back to that flat ground in Tunisia one more time. A clear afternoon, the sun coming in low from the west. That faint, circular depression in the pale soil. The ghost of a harbor that once held the ships of the most commercially active civilization in the ancient world. 2,000 years of silence in a place that was once among the busiest ports on Earth. Ships departed from that basin for destinations the record does not fully account for, carrying knowledge the record does not preserve, crewed by sailors whose understanding of the Atlantic was deeper than anything we can fully reconstruct. Off the Moroccan coast right now, the northeast trade winds are blowing toward the west. They have blown every day for the whole of human history, steadily and without interruption, toward a coastline 5,000 kilometers away. They carry no memory of any ship that may have entered them and kept going. They hold no record of any captain who may have watched the African coast disappear behind him, who may have stood at the stern in the growing dark, with stars appearing above an ocean that offered no visible shore in any direction, and made the decision to keep sailing. The wind simply blows west, as it has always done, toward whatever was or was not waiting on the other side. If this kind of slow, careful walk through the edges of what history knows and does not know is something you find worth your time, I would be glad to have you back. There are other questions like this one waiting. Questions where the silence in the record is not emptiness, but something more interesting. And there is, I think, something genuinely satisfying about sitting with them, without rushing toward an answer the evidence cannot yet provide.